All right, everyone. Greetings and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by Elevate Vets. My name is Joshua Ryder. I serve as the Executive Director for the Center for Adult Veteran Services at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. Some housekeeping, etc. Let's talk about Elevate Vets for a second. Elevate, and we're going to drop the links in the chat for you, is an organization created by Veterans Education Success and made possible through a generous donation from the ECMC Foundation. A link content, information to higher education administrators, professionals like ourselves who serve our military connected students. That's the purpose. The idea is that if we get better, we know more, have more tools at our disposal, we'll be better at supporting these students and making their time at our institutions productive and their path to graduation, whatever that may look like, whatever those degrees might be, whatever their education goal, much smoother. So content that's about to be delivered today is an example. This policy update that Will Hubbard's gonna cover for us. Housekeeping and ground rules for today. Camera and mics are gonna remain off. However, we do want to hear from you. So please drop those questions into the Q&A section, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. And lastly, this will be recorded and sent out after our time together sometime later on this week. That'll come out as an email to everybody that was registered for this event. So thank you very much, and I'm looking very excited myself to hear the update that we have from Will and Barmac today. So I'm going to hop off and let these gentlemen take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. My name is Barmac Nassirian. I am Vice President for Higher Ed Policy with VES. We always benefit from Joshua's guidance and direction on these webinars and want to bring you up to speed on what's going on, primarily within the specific vet space, the House and Senate Veterans Affairs Committees, but there are a couple of issues that fall under my jurisdiction that I will touch on at the very end. So I will hand it over to my colleague, Will Hubbard, to start the webinar, even though I don't see him. Do you see him, Joshua? I don't know. Did he drop out?
I do see that Will has popped off here. I'm sure he'll be rejoining us in 1 second. Okay. Well, maybe I was just say just kind of roll with it and maybe grab your.
How about them Knicks?
How about those? How about yeah? How about that? You know, boy, we can get into some of that. We can. I'm a Cleveland Cavaliers person myself, but
I understand.
yeah,
Is that
diehard
why
Cavs.
you're in the witness protection program with that backlighting
It is
to
why. That's why
hide
Cleveland.
your identity?
Yes, all Cleveland fans live in this area. This is where we live in. It's some type of witness protection type of
Right.
an environment. It's pretty desperate here in the land from
Yeah.
time to time. But yeah, so no, I guess looks like Will has just lost power and his hop is just came back on and he's hopping back online. So sorry, folks, as we just transition our presenter back on. Just give us 1 or 2 more minutes for him to hop back on here. But yeah, I wasn't aware that there was the power outage in the greater DC area, so it's probably just
There he
happened.
is.
And he's back. Will, you are actually up, so over
Yep,
to
sorry
you.
about that.
No problem.
I think I'm gonna keep my video off if that's all right. While I get these slides up. Sorry about that.
Absolutely.
All right, here we go.
So it turns out that Will is having massive technical issues, which means that I am going to do the presentation that he has prepared as soon as I find it. Let's see.
Looks great, Barmac.
You can see it?
Yep, absolutely. Yep, ready to go.
All right. So we're dealing with the remaining few months, weeks of this session of Congress. Number of significant policy proposals are taking shape. There are a number of changes coming specifically to veterans legislation, veterans programs that we're going to cover, and then I'm going to touch at the very end on some of the regulatory issues affecting Title IV that have downstream impact on veterans as well. So there is a giant, massive veterans omnibus package that has already been introduced, and we have kind of a mixed take on. There are about 60, it's almost like 60 different pieces of legislation, bipartisan, many of them Democratic priorities, many of them Republican priorities. They have all been bundled together. In general, on balance, the primary components of the legislation and the bulk of the dollars tend to go to programs outside of education, but there are a couple of provisions within that package, within the omnibus package, that do have impact on education and are of some concern to us. So first and foremost, there is the issue of the budget offset or pay for. The package has a pretty significant cost. And as you know, the administration has been pretty adamant, and the majority, congressional majority, have been pretty adamant that they want to contain domestic spending and try to offset the cost of new legislation. This legislation's pay for is changes to a couple of disability benefits that have garnered pretty significant opposition from some veterans organizations. This is because the legislation reduces benefits for two specific disabilities: sleep apnea and tinnitus, ringing in the ears, that according to the majority would be reduced regulatorily anyway. So this is almost sort of viewed as a harmless offset because those benefit reductions were supposed to be implemented in October through regulatory changes. But many veterans groups are very concerned because their attitude is, well, you know, first of all, we don't know that those regulations would stand in the face of opposition that has already been mounted to them. And more importantly, even if they were to stand, enshrining the limitations that are being imposed here in the legislation makes it all the more difficult downstream to deal with any changes. Therefore, the opposition has been pretty adamant, not only from veterans groups, but also from particularly the Senate minority. And remember, this is an omnibus standalone package. In other words, it has to pass. It's a policy change, and policy changes, at least in the Senate, require a 60-vote margin. So they would need 10 Democratic votes to pass it. And it appears that the Democratic side, at least of the committee at this point, is pretty adamantly opposed to the legislation, not so much on necessarily in terms of the affirmative things it does, but in terms of its pay for. So that's one component of this that you need to be aware of. But when it comes to the substance of the changes within education, there are two provisions I want to flag for you. One of which we are quite alarmed about, and that is Section 201B, the so-called independent study provisions. This has struck us as a kind of a special interest provision. It affects unaccredited online independent study courses. I don't want to overstate I don't want to create a caricature of it, but it's basically almost akin to watching YouTube videos and learning things. Those things are generally either free because you watch ads, or you get a YouTube subscription for a fairly low price and you can watch up to your heart's content. This is a little akin to that. I'm being a little unfair because obviously the package is supposed to be something proprietary from the school, but there are very few guardrails other than a mandate for a periodic review of providers, which will be conducted by SAAs. The problem is SAAs are not really educational authorities. They're basically in charge of paperwork audits. So I have no doubt that the paperwork will be in order. Whether anybody learns anything is a matter that usually accreditors deal with, and these are unaccredited programs. And then there is a GAO study mandated to sort of see the impact, and those things take years, during which period many vets will end up exhausting their benefits on programs of dubious value. Some time ago, when the Department of Education was holding negotiated rulemaking sessions with public comment, something that this administration has eliminated, the public comment piece of it, we actually had veterans who testified about things like entirely online gunsmithing courses. Now those courses were at least accredited. Now, I don't know the extent to which you want to entrust your gun to a gunsmith who only learned his or her trade online, but these would be unaccredited courses, which is even more troubling. So that's one component of it which we're very alarmed about. The other piece of it, which in itself may be manageable and justifiable in some cases, but that may be a harbinger of something bigger, is the Section 203 online housing allowance. As you know, the housing allowance currently extends not only to in-person instructions, but even to hybrid programs that include any in-person component. You get the standard housing allowance based on the location of the program. Now, what this proposal does is it extends it only for the summer, for summer terms, on a prorated basis to entirely online students at half the national average. Again, with regard to summer, there may be some justification for this. We also always conceded that there are exceptional cases where some kind of entirely online program may justify a greater housing allowance, for example, for students with disabilities, for whom mobility is a significant issue. We do have a concern, however, which I would welcome your comments on, about the potential of moving to this kind of a model, or anything even remotely like it, for as a rule for all entirely online programs. And the reason is because anything that is pegged to the national average for entirely online students could very easily be susceptible to abuse by unscrupulous providers who may actually end up recruiting veterans out of legitimate in-person programs in low-cost states, in low housing rate states, and entice them to go into questionable online programs solely because of the boost it would give them in terms of their housing allowance. So that's a concern that this doesn't immediately give rise to by itself, but this could be kind of greasing the skids for a shift in that direction downstream, which has been a priority of many mega universities that excel at heavy-handed recruiting, particularly of veterans. So these are the two pieces of this particular omnibus bill that we are currently analyzing and we have some concerns about. So we wanted to flag those for your attention. And then there is one issue that I want to bring up here with regard to what seems to be a concerted effort to alter or entirely eliminate the so-called 90-10 rule. And the 90-10 rule, as most traditional colleges would not even know about or particularly care about the 90-10 rule, because it specifically addresses for-profit Title IV participants. These are schools that are eligible to participate in student financial aid programs, which in the case of for-profits are limited to no of their entire revenues in two sequential years being above 90%. So the notion is that you cannot derive more than 90% of your revenues from all federal sources 2 years in a row. If you cross that threshold 2 years in a row, the vast majority of Title IV institutions dates back to the early 90s, to the 1992 reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act. Back then it was 8515, not to be confused with the 8515 rule in VA programs. But it's been around. It had a giant loophole, which was that it only limited schools to 90% of revenues derived from Title IV. This created a particularly perverse incentive for the worst actors who couldn't derive a meager 10 cents on the dollar from any private sources, essentially targeting veterans, because veterans' money counted on the 10% side of the ratio, and essentially became a gateway. For every dollar of VA money that they could capture $9 of Title IV money, still be 100% dependent on federal funds, but be in compliance with the 90-10 rule, because it was only 90% of those funds were coming from Title IV. In 2021, the law was changed so that the 90% component of that ratio was inclusive of all federal funds. But this made a big difference, and there was the number of institutions that would have tripped that actually ended up diminishing, because institutions got the message. Institutions that would have been above 90%, once that law was passed, began to reorient their marketing so that they could capture 10 cents on the dollar from non-federal sources. Rulemaking, there was consensus with the for-profits at the table on the regulations, and in the 2 years subsequent to that, we had only 5 schools trip the wire that year, the first year, and 16 schools the second year. So it's not a particularly onerous thing to derive 10 cents on the dollar from some source other than the federal government. Despite that, however, it appears that the for-profit sector has identified this as one of their affirmative goals to eliminate, presumably because at that point you're not a private sector entity, you're just a creature of federal programs. But be that as it may, it seems to be a particular target of that sector's lobbying. And we see that in multiple pieces of legislation, one of which is in the appropriations bill passed by the House as a rider, as a de facto funding prohibition, where no funds appropriated under this title may be used to enforce the 90-10 rule for the next fiscal year. Remember, if you zero out the funding for 1 year, you've basically scuttled the rule for 2 years, because you need to fail twice in a row, and zeroing it out for 1 year affects not only anybody who would have been ineligible that year, but also prevents anybody who does become ineligible next year from being excluded because there is no rate for the prior year. So that's an adverse provision. We do not expect this to survive, but we see this as kind of an overreach by the sector in terms of smelling an opportunity to go full hilt in search of additional federal subsidies at a time when federal dollars are getting more scarce. It sounds like corporate welfare to us, and we're certainly concerned about this. There are also a couple of other standalone pieces of legislation attempting to actually completely repeal the law, which would be quite problematic, but we will see how those things work. So do pay attention to this, because it is again, overreach, it seems to me, by the sector against a fairly modest demand that schools demonstrate some measure of market viability by generating 10 cents on the dollar from some other source than the feds. So that's that. And then there is one other very important change that is currently in the works, and it has to do with pretty drastic changes coming to accreditation. Now, accreditation is obviously a Title IV Education Department policy issue, but it has an enormous impact on the back end on the VA, because eligibility for VA programs do rely on accreditation in pretty critical ways. And what we've seen from this administration, with no change in statute, there was no legislative change to create this level of drastic overhaul of accreditation, but the Trump administration inaugurated a regulatory process to revamp accreditation, essentially targeting an expansion of the number of eligible accreditors, and then significantly reducing, at least with regard to some aspects of the recognition process of the way in which accreditors become de facto federal proxies, reforming them in the direction of making it easier for new accreditors and legacy accreditors to continue to function. It is of concern to us because at the end of the day, really within the entire system, accreditors are the only oversight entity charged with quality assurance. Quality assurance, they're mostly administrative and financial overseers, and the question of, all the paperwork can be in perfect order, but are the students learning anything worth the time and the effort and the amount of federal subsidies that go? Those are questions to enter programs, to gain eligibility, not only for Title IV, whether there are comments or questions beyond the fact that we anticipate a lot of these issues sort of um, remaining unresolved. For approps, it is very unlikely that we're going to end up with an appropriations bill of any kind. Chances are we're going to end up with a what they call a continuing resolution, which is sort of a punt beyond the election. And heaven knows what's going to happen after these elections. We will have a lame duck session, certainly after the election. And that's the point at which anything goes. But we're hoping that most of these riders can be pulled out of the appropriations. Whether the omnibus bill has a chance or not, hard to guess. In general, we've always been very proud that the VA committees have operated with great bipartisanship and in a become so polarized that nothing was getting done. The veterans committees have always been very functional, very bipartisan together, because I think veterans continue to enjoy real, genuine bipartisan support. We are hoping that that can be restored. Aspects of the bill can pass. There are a couple of what we see as somewhat problematic provisions that we hope to work with them to improve. But that's that. Open to any comments and questions, and apologies in advance for the fact that I'm not Will Hubbard.
Hey, no problem. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Barmak. All right, folks, go ahead and drop your questions into that Q&A pod there, just so we can kind of go ahead and work through these here. Nothing is there so far, so I guess you explained everything, Barmak. I guess
either that or I stunned them into silence. Yeah, that your mission accomplished is the word these days.
It is. It is. It's something we say. It is. All right, everyone. Give it a couple more seconds here, and then as are available, they've been made available for you as well to take a look at. And then, of course, we'll send this whole recording out afterwards after we registered. So, any pressing questions for anybody? Anything for our DC subject matter expert here that we can?
In addition to any questions, we would also welcome any intel or any comments, any advice, any particular issue that you're seeing that we're not seeing. This is the time. This would be an opportunity to attempt to get some things done. So if there are email or however you want to get back to us.
Hey, all right. So we have one here, and Jason, I guess somebody indicated that the chat was disabled, but I think it is maybe for attendees perhaps, but just make sure that Q&A pod is open. I do see that we do have one here. What was the rationale for the increased Chapter 33 housing allowance for online only to be in summer terms only?
Well,
defies
first,
logic, in my opinion.
Yeah, the idea. First of all, I want to emphasize it's prorated, so it's not like you can just take one course and receive a full housing allowance for the 4 months of the summer or whatever. It's prorated to the kind of percentage of the full-time status that you would otherwise have. The rationale is expedited time to graduation. If a student is genuinely sort of going year round, that they ought to be able to also receive their housing allowance year round. We are not unsympathetic to that notion. The problem, again, and this is a disparity that, no legitimate school is going to, quote unquote, market itself on the strength of its housing allowance that the vet receives. Legitimate schools market themselves on the strength of their program and the outcomes and the mobility that the programs provide. Our worry is, and you remember this, some of you may remember this from some years back when, a lot of unscrupulous schools were basically enrolling and recruiting veterans. Or if you come here, a laptop is that's the selling point. We're worried about allowance, which will be, if they peg it to the national average, there will be plenty of institutions in low-cost areas averages. The giant sucking sound would be of veterans leaving the classroom at legitimate schools to go to questionable online programs because to your housing allowance. Of course, that's, that upfront benefit, quote unquote, would be more than negated by questionable economic outcomes for those vets who end up graduate programs that offer candidly. Often we don't want veterans to essentially waste their benefits at places that don't offer value. Yes, the housing allowance is an important, but we don't want to turn it into a self recruiting veterans on that basis. But I know plenty of places that will, and that's problematic.
Yeah, great. Yep, absolutely. And it's been some time. I know, Sherrod Brown from state of Ohio here did a lot of work on that years ago, 2013, 2014, 15, a lot of institutions on the run for a while, for sure, with a lot of those provisions. Anything else, you can use either the chat. We have that out here as well now. And then we have the Q&A. Otherwise, we won't belabor it. We just want to give you the opportunity. Again, if there's other things that, if there's questions about any of the material provided today, or if you have any other issues that, again, you want to bring up to us that perhaps that certainly Barmak and Will are not, of which they are not aware. All right, cool. Terry stipend, regardless of what is best for them, in my opinion. Sort of like buying the Corvette with your tax-free pay. Joe will do it regardless of what we tell them, right? We need to help protect them from themselves. Smaller markets with less than 100% national average rates will be impacted. Just saying.
Terry, you are as usual right, and that is the concern. Again, we don't want to act in loco parentis. Veterans are grown-ups and that can make their own decisions. But the problem is with education. Education is what economists call a credence good. It's something. It's not even like a meal. There's a difference between buying a color TV that you can turn on and inspect before you buy, a meal that you have to pay for it before you know whether it was good or not. It's a done deal. And then education, where you don't even know the quality after you consume the service. It'll take 20 years before you know you. And we so often see veterans who've been ripped off, who only learn 5, 6, 10 years after the fact. And a lot of these schools stigmatize the victim. A lot of these schools end up blaming the student for the poor outcomes, when in fact it was the school that essentially offered nothing of value to them other than a piece of paper that didn't really generate any appreciable return for them. So yeah, we need to have guardrails around these benefits to ensure that veterans do receive the kind of mobility and income wage enhancement that we all hope these programs generate.
All right. Well, we'll just give it a going once, going twice, and sold. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Barmak, for this content, for delivering that with us today. And thank you for everyone who attended. And we'll be getting this out to you within the next couple of days after we clean it up a little bit here. We'll be sending it out to everyone that registered. So have a wonderful day, and thanks for joining us.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.